What's up, guys? John Beaupre, aka Casino Crime here, and got another video for you this week. Think you're going to really like it. What we're going to do is we're going to cover delayed C betting, which I think is a topic that isn't covered very much in other videos. We're going to cover a lot of really good tips, of course, as always, general rule of thumb. But before we hop right into that, as always, what I want to do is start off with a quote. And this is a quote written by Malcolm Gladwell in the book Outliers, which if you haven't read, I'm sure that I'll give it as a recommendation in the future. But for now, just look at this quote and kind of see how it resonates with you. And it says, practice isn't the thing you do once you're good, it's the thing you do that makes you good. And in Outliers, he talks a lot about performance and kind of what separates, the hidden traits or the hidden X factors for people that have been very successful in life. It's a really great book, but the reason that this quote resonated with me is I think a lot of players in poker, it's very difficult to be regimented, and the path from being, knowing completely nothing about poker and having only ambition and motivation, all the way to being like, a high stakes pro and successful in this game is pretty unconventional, and there's no like proven formula for it, right? You can go on forums, you can listen to people who have been successful, and they can all say, read a bunch of books or get to know high stakes players, or and then just grind your ass off. But it's really not that easy. How you learn different skill sets, what games you play, and what in particular, which game in particular really works well for you that you enjoy enough to play like 8 to 12 hours a day, is different for everyone. But one thing that's the same is the amount of practice, right? The amount of dedication. But more specifically is the way that you practice, right? If you're not practicing with a purpose, he calls it, in another book he actually calls it perfect practice. If you're not practicing the right way, if you're just kind of haphazardly grinding or passively watching videos and not taking good notes, you're actually only practicing getting worse. And I think that a lot of players who aren't experiencing results, this is the main problem, is they don't have very good practice, and they get in the habit of playing poorly when it doesn't matter, so that they play poorly when it does matter. So, there's a lot of good resources out there. I know there's some good videos here on Deuces Cracked. Of course, there's good videos on my website. And, I continue to recommend good books and stuff for you guys to read. But realistically, what you should be focusing on is improving the way that you practice, improving the way that you do stuff away from the table. And of course, like improving your thought process on the felt. But in general, just remember that the longer you go without improving your bad habits, the longer you go without replacing your bad habits with good habits, the longer you go without addressing the weakest areas of your game, the more likely you are to consistently repeat those bad habits and allow them to be to make deeper cuts into your game. So with that being said, let's move on to the lesson. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about delayed C betting and 3-bet pots. In other videos I've talked a lot about the decision of whether to C bet or not in 3-bet pots. And from what I remember, we didn't focus as much on delayed C betting. I'm sure that we breezed over whether or not we should C bet or not, and kind of included delayed C betting in our options. But today what I really want to focus on is just hands where I actually decided to delayed C bet, why I did it, and which situations are best for it, and kind of what the logic and the reasoning is behind it. If you guys haven't checked that out, maybe you should go and watch the videos. I made them like several months ago, and they were on playing 3-bet pots specifically and focusing on different board textures, both when in position and out of position. That should really help you play profitably in 3-bet pots. On the topic of 3-bet pots, the reason why it's so important to learn how to play 3-bet pots is because they are re-raised pots. There's more big blinds to fight for, and especially if you're playing a lot of short-handed PLO, we can see here in this hand that we're playing 3-handed, but in any, 6 max, 5 max, doesn't really matter. Like, the more shorter-handed you play online, the more important it is to be aggressive, and you can't really just avoid like playing re-raised pots when you're playing short-handed. If you are, it's important, you got to re-raise out of position, both for your image, also because people's ranges are so wide from late position and shorthanded. So there's some money to just outright be won from the players who are playing too many hands, calling too many 3-bets, and don't really know how to defend properly in that way. So, yeah, I mean, in general, a lot of the style that I teach and that other instructors teach too is to, play a little bit tighter out of position and whatnot, but there is spots where you kind of need to be more aggressive and learn how to c-bet effectively and delayed c-bet effectively. So we're going to cover that today. So here in our first hand, we can see the button raises 2.5x to 10. We 3-bet ace-jack 7-3, double suited improperly. Improperly meaning that we're suited to the ace and we're suited to the 7. So, the 3-bet standard, I like it. You don't have to 3-bet this, but this guy looks like he's getting in there pretty hardcore, 59-40. Probably loose and bad, kind of aggressive. So we're certainly doing fine against a button opening range. And when I'm selecting hands to 3-bet from the small blind, these are the kind of hands that I like. Sure, I would prefer that it was suited to the ace and the jack, but as far as 3-handed goes, this is a pretty good hand. Realistically, I like unpaired hands when I'm out of position. You want hands that are capable of flopping like a pair and a draw so that we can stack off lighter, and also unpaired hands, pick up more equity on later streets than paired hands do. So, yeah, I mean, is this hand unbelievable? No, but it's certainly good enough against a wide button opening range. Before we go any further, something that I like to look at when I'm analyzing whether or not to 3-bet is the steal percentage of the players. It's only 100 hands, but we can see he's stealing pretty wide. This is my steal percentage right here. Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually right here. And we can see that he's stealing 70%. Now, that's a combination of both the cutoff and the button. I would imagine that his button stealing range is a little bit wider, and you can't see it, but I will tell you that his raise first in from the button is actually 74%, so it's a little bit higher. And what you want to look at when you're playing 6-max is the difference between how often players are raising in the cutoff versus how often they're raising from the button, and that's something we'll talk about in later hands too. So flop comes Jack 10-8 two-tone. We've got top pair and a crappy backdoor flush draw and a gutter, but it's not like a good gutter. It's like a non-nut gutter, I guess. And so, is this hand good enough to play for stacks? I personally don't think so. I think it would be really close depending on how wide someone's getting it in on this flop, and I would have to run the exact numbers. But my first instinct is that if you bet and get jammed on here, you're probably doing pretty poorly. And in re-raised pots, of course, it's the same in single-raised pots, but especially in re-raised pots, your profitability and how people perceive your range is all about how a board texture should connect with your range. I think that in general, most players would perceive this board to be pretty connected with a small blind 3-betting range. And in any situation in poker, if it looks like you have something good, or you should have something good in any given situation, and someone's willing to put more money in the pot against you, it's probably a bad sign. So, as you might imagine, I decided to check and evaluate. Now, why would delayed c-betting here be an option? Well, first of all, like I just mentioned, if I bet and get it in, I'm really not too pleased with how poorly I'm going to get it in here. The SPR is kind of awkward. It's a little bit over 5. So it's a little bit bigger than your average 100 big blind 3-bet pot. And I think that, it's in 2009, back in the day, people used to stab at these spots pretty widely in 3-bet pots because, people only 3-bet aces back then. But now people are giving you a lot more credit for having whiff check raises in your range. So I think people are a lot more likely to just check back when they don't have anything and allow you to get more information by way of, when they check back on a flop like this, it's, most people don't have slow plays. So that means that usually when they check back this flop, it's genuine weakness. So I like to, being out of position in a way in this kind of situation is almost like being on the button. We can check and get more information. and we can delayed c-bet on turns and get a lot of credit for having whiff check raises, which we decide to do. We pot the turn. This is where it gets a little bit interesting, and he calls. What do I think about the pot-sized bet? I'm honestly not completely sure why I chose the pot-sized bet at this time. I don't think that it's really necessary. I think that what I was thinking is that, and I was experimenting a little bit with this at the time, was that people just fold like 100% almost to pot-sized bets, and they get a lot more credit. So I'm not completely sure why I chose a pot-sized bet, but I think that betting would be mandatory. The smallest I would bet would be like 58, but I would bet my standard would be to bet somewhere like 58, 62, something like that. But I decided to pot it, and our opponent calls. We decided to pot the river as well. I actually, as played, think that this is an okay bet. Again, a moment ago I said that it's one of those situations where when hand rating comes into play, if it's clear that he has something and I'm still betting pretty big, and I think that that's kind of the line that looks the strongest here. Something else to consider, and a lot of players get themselves into trouble here, is they pick good spots to bluff on the river, but they choose too small of a sizing, so their opponents are priced in to call. A lot of times when I'm bluffing, especially nowadays, where people are a little bit stickier, it seems, I tend to bomb it. It doesn't change the profitability of your river bluffs that much, but it, in my opinion, affects a lot how often bluffs get through. So I think that actually the bet sizing is okay. I certainly don't want to price him into a call with like an 8-10 or 8-5 type of hand, which I think that he can have a lot of like junky two pairs that will fold to a big enough bet. And he does fold. So, not to be results oriented, but I think it's an okay play. Not to mention also, I think like since I checked the flop and then like bet the turn, like he could still have like a pretty wide range. He didn't bet the flop, so he should still be pretty weak. So I think that we can represent a straight pretty well. And we know he doesn't have queen 9, so unless he backdoored like ace queen, it's very difficult for him to have a straight. And I think that I think it's really difficult for him to call with most two pair hands. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, this is kind of a similar situation where we're facing a button open, and we decide to ace or 3-bet ace jack 4-3 with a nut suit. It's an aggressive 3-bet, no doubt, but and I don't remember my exact reasoning for 3-betting this hand. This guy seems kind of a bad reg, and again, like I like to pull up the stats and see he's raising first in only 43% from the button, so it's not like he's terribly loose here, but I guess it's only 7 hands, but it seems like he's playing pretty aggressively. So I think four-handed, and especially with the weaker player in the big blind here, this reg probably is going to be raising just an extremely wide range. And I will say that a big piece of my strategy is to hammer button openers a lot harder than cutoff opens. If people want to open wider from the cutoff, I'll let them do that pretty mercilessly, but how wide I 3-bet has a lot to do with whether they open from the cutoff or on the button. Most players there's a big gap between how wide they raise from the cutoff and how wide they raise from the button. Usually it's almost double. A lot of players will like steal 35% from the cutoff, but they'll open 75% or 70% from the button. So in No Limit, the way that you combat wide openers is you 3-bet wider. You 3-bet bluff a lot more because players fold to 3-bets a lot more in No Limit. But in PLO, the way that you combat wide openers, since 3-bet calling ranges are a lot wider in PLO, you beat them by 3-betting and c-betting because, of course, weak pre-flop ranges, they don't flop equity often enough to continue. So you can make a lot of money just by like 3-betting and c-betting and barreling against wide ranges. But again, like ranges are much tighter from the cutoff, so I'll be a lot less likely to 3-bet a cutoff open from out of position than I am to 3-bet a button open. So that's my reasoning for the 3-betting. We do call. The flop comes 10-7-5 rainbow. It's not a great flop for us, And in fact, I think that it hits most button ranges. So we do decide to check, and he checks back. Now, the turn's a 5, and I just think that, again, like it depends on what level your opponents are on. If you're playing regs, or you're playing other type of like competent players, especially in, now we're into 2015, a lot of players recognize that you can have hands that fit into this board texture. So you can certainly have whiffed check ranges. And in fact, that's a strong component of good PLO play, is having check raises on this board. So you can really get credit for a lot here by just leading, which I do, and you get a good price on your bluff as well. I don't think that I'm gonna necessarily like follow through on all river cards, but there is some good river cards for me. If I make a 6, or if the river's a 6, like I can check or I can value bet. Sometimes, an ace, like we can check or we can actually even bet and get called pretty light there. So it just kind of depends. Like I actually like this bet. We get a good price on the bluff. We can have whiff check raises in our range, and we could even have a 5. Why not? And he does decide to fold. So what I'm really getting at by showing you this hand is, as a rule, and we'll have a couple of other hands like this. I've talked a lot about the difference between dynamic and static turns. A static turn is when the board pairs or the turn completes a flush. And if you're going to check the flop, you have to force yourself to bet 100% of static turns. So what that would mean is that if this was a 2-tone flop and the turn filled the flush, I would always bet it. Or if, in this case, if the turn pairs the board, I always bet it if I checked the flop. Most of the time I'll bet those two if I bet the flop, but it's important if you're in a heads-up pot and you have the opportunity to be the first one to place a bet on a static turn, that you do so. And we'll have other hand histories that go over this, but I think that in a spot on these boards where you can have whiffed check raises, it's a good spot to delayed c-bet when the turn is good for you or when it's a static turn. This is a similar hand to one we played recently that I went over, but it's still good to go over it, so we will. So the button makes it 12, we make it 40 with Jack, 8-7 with a suit. Against the right button opener, I think this is a good play. We could see he's stealing 44% overall, but again, like, let's see, his raise first in on the button is 46. So not like a super terrible, not a big like late position opener, but nevertheless like a button opener, and again, like a lot of players don't really like to fold to 3-bets when they open the button, and as such, like since they have wide pre-flop ranges, we really can just print money by like 3-betting and c-betting. And so a lot of hands that are playable, if I think that players are straightforward, or maybe they're playing a bunch of tables, or they're just kind of like bad regs, I like to put more money into the pot against them and make them adjust to my aggression. So he calls, the flop's Queen 8-4 rainbow, and we decide to check. In retrospect, I'm not too sure about my check here, and I think I'd prefer just betting and barreling. I certainly don't want to check fold. Our hand isn't good enough to just like check jam. So my default here would be to just bet. We could bet like 58. I think that's a pretty good amount. And we get a lot, this is a board that connects pretty well with our range. And we should just get a lot of folds, and I think that against some ranges, like it's just like a value bet. The other thing that's nice is having the jack blockers. We have, they serve as straight blockers, so that's nice. So we can barrel like, a 9 or a 10 pretty effectively. And we have an 8, which is nice. So that gives us a little bit more equity. So I think that my standard would be to just bet and barrel. But as played, looks like we check, and he checks back. Again, like I mentioned, I think that most ranges that check back on this flop will be weaker. A lot of players are like, they don't stab wide enough here. So I think that most of the time when he checks back, he's probably like just going to be giving up. We decide to bet, and he calls. River's an ace, and again, like this is the whole theory of we can have whiffed check raises in our range. So it's kind of nice. Like we could have aces, why not? And a variety of different hands. I think that like, of course we do beat air, but I think that it's highly like it's highly likely that our opponent has either a queen or a misdraw for the most part. Most players don't have the discipline to just peel with a 4 on the turn. So I'm mostly just thinking that he either has a queen or he has a misdraw, and although sometimes you could check call here, I think it would be more profitable to just turn our hand into a bluff. So I pot it like in the other hand, where I mentioned that our opponent's range is pretty elastic, and although this is difficult to balance in most cases, I don't know if like players are really thinking about that. I think that they're just kind of looking at their hand, seeing if it's worth 200 euros, and deciding whether to call or not. And he does fold. So again, like, our line is okay, but more than anything, what I wanted to do was point out, like, this river bet and delayed c-betting. Our opponent's range it's certainly elastic. Like, I think that if we bet 100, he might just dial with maybe even just a queen. It's possible. But if we pot it, I think he's just like always folding. So it's fine to just turn our hand into a bluff here. Okay, this next hand, we're a little bit shorter stacked. Looks like it's a 40 big blind buy-in table, perhaps. I don't know. Regardless, it's not really about the stack size in this hand. It's more about the board texture that I wanted to talk about. So we 3-bet a cutoff open with 10-9-8-6 with a suit, and the cutoff calls. A few hands ago, I mentioned that I typically shy away from 3-betting cutoff opens as wide as button opens. But this hand, it's deceptive, and I'm short, so I'm not going to get in like too many difficult. I'm not going to get myself in too many difficult situations post flop because I'm just so short, so it doesn't really matter. And I don't like calling and playing this hand 3-way. So it's just a much better like heads up hand. So again, like I think somebody who's he looks like this guy in particular is stealing 45% overall. Let's look at his raise first in from the cutoff and on the button. So yeah, all right, so he's 29% from the cutoff and 65% on the button. This is a similar. This is that highlights like kind of what I was talking about earlier. A lot of players will be much tighter from the cutoff than they will on the button. So is this an ideal hand to 3-bet a cutoff opener with? It's not ideal, but I think it's good enough. Especially I look pretty strong, so I'm gonna win a lot of c-bets on big boards sometimes, and it's going to be deceptive, so it's important to have like good board coverage even when you're short stacked. He does call. It comes Ace King 5 rainbow. So this is the reason I included this hand was to say that he's just gonna have like when I'm this short, and you guys will play short stacked at some point, like whether it's a tournament or a cash game. Like a lot of you guys buy in shorter, so this is a good one to talk about anyway. But people aren't going to fold like an ace or a king for the most part when you're this short. So, when you're deeper, there's merit for like betting and barreling because we have like a backdoor straight draw, we have a backdoor flush draw, and we just take it down enough of the time because hey, it's Ace King 5 rainbow. So if people don't flop anything or they flop something like weak and medium, then they'll just give up to your c-bet. But when you're this short, like no one's folding any ace. And a lot of their like king and side cards will have, like a king with a straight draw anyway, like king queen jack type combos or king jack 10 type combos. Those aren't going to fold. And like in general, I highly recommend not avoiding situations where you are betting and barreling with no equity or like a low amount of equity. It's just not profitable. But hey, if we check, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily giving up on the pot, right? Not to mention that if we check, it actually kind of looks stronger than if we bet. Like this is a board that we're supposed to be c-betting a lot. So when we check, it actually kind of looks suspicious. So I think that there's like also some benefits to checking. Now I think it's important to mention that again, like there's a big difference of which player I'm facing and where they open from. So if we were playing the same player and he had opened the button, I think I would c-bet this because his range will include a lot less ace X and king X combos. But since he opened from the cutoff and we don't have any ace or any king, it's pretty. I think that we're going to run into a hand that he's willing to stack off with a very high percentage of the time. So he does check, and we get like a great turn. Now it's like, we're clearly not folding. We're going to put more money in the pot in one way or the other. So it's important to kind of look at the SPR and figure out what our best option is. Like, we could check jam, or we could just bet and barrel. And I think the betting and barreling is our best option. We have whiff check raises in our range again. We know that he doesn't have aces. I think it's pretty unlikely that he has kings. A lot of like kings combos would have just stuck it in pre-flop against us, because we have an aggressive dynamic with this player. Now it's just about betting and barreling, and typically like what I would do is, and it looks like I did here, is set up a two-street game where I'm going to bet and jam a lot of rivers, or maybe like bet and then check and evaluate depending on the river, but most of the time I'll like bet and barrel. And the thing that's nice about picking this sizing and is, because we got to leave ourselves, not only give ourselves a good price on the immediate bet, but also leave ourselves enough big blinds to jam the river. Our opponent just folds the turn, but I just wanted to talk about like this board texture and sort of like the dynamic between, cutoff button, small blind, big blind, stuff like that. All right, in this next hand, we've got a pretty nice double suited rundown from the small blind. Button opens, we 3-bet, and he calls. It's important to note that he min opened, and it's also important to note how the SPR changes when players do min open. I mean, you have to recognize that like if players min open, the SPR is still going to be pretty high post flop. So, and it doesn't seem like a lot, but it actually is. When we 3-bet here, we can only 3-bet to 14. If he had opened a pot, we can make it 23, which is a big difference. So it changes the SPR a lot. In this case, like our hand is too strong for, it's like the perfect candidate for 3-betting out of position. It has a lot of good board coverage. On like ace and king high flops, we'll get a lot of credit. On like lower boards, we will be deceptive. So it's important, especially like this guy looks like a reg, and it's important against those types of players to have good board coverage so that they're not just, that they part of where the profitability of calling in position comes from is, yes, of course, like making big hands and having more information to get paid, but it's also by like being able to read the opponent, knowing which boards connect well with the range, and then stealing it based on that, or getting extra value when you flop something strong. So, that's pretty much it. So flop is 5-7-3 two-tone. We've got a wrap, a very nice wrap, and a backdoor flush draw. Now, the first step that I usually take when I'm playing a 3-bet pot is I look at the SPR. And most of the time, I tell students that the most difficult SPRs to play are like an SPR of around 2 and an SPR of around 6. And most of the time, I try to avoid playing these SPRs in 3-bet pots. But sometimes like when your hand is just so good, like ours is here, it doesn't, I'm willing to like put myself in that thinner situation. But you can this situation highlights a little bit of why it's a troublesome SPR. I mean, if we bet, a lot of times you just get peeled and get kind of messed with on later streets. We don't really have like a good stack to leverage our entire stack. And our opponent kind of has the edge when it's this SPR. So, our hand like really benefits from seeing all 3 streets if we can, and just sort of letting the hand play out, and not like I feel, I don't think that our hand, although our hand looks really strong, we don't have a pair. Like if we had 5, 6, 7, 8, I'd be pretty happy about just like betting and getting it in here. But we don't have a pair, we don't have a flush draw, so our hand is a lot less stronger than you think. If somebody has like a pair and a flush draw, we're not doing very well. And I think it would be, we certainly don't want to, when the SPR is 6, to just like get it in against that player. Like, of course, if the SPR was 1, we're fine just getting it in here, like betting and getting it in and hoping that, our fold equity just like gets him to fold. But like getting it in if we have to. Here, when the SPR is 6, like we really don't want to like bet and get raised. Betting and like getting floated isn't very comfortable. Because like even if we complete our hand on the turn, it's not like we can get stacks in. So I think that delayed c-betting has a lot of merit here. You know, if we delayed c-bet, like if we check and he bets, like we get a good read on what amount he bets, like the strength of his hand. We guarantee ourselves to see a turn with like a reasonably favorable SPR for us. Or we could, if he checks, like we can delayed c-bet. And again, like in 2015, I think that most regs know that other regs have reasonable board coverage. So it's not like you can't get credit for having a straight completing hand or like a flush completing hand on this board. As it stands, like it goes check check, and as I mentioned in the other hand history, whenever the turn is static and you checked the flop, you almost always want to bet the turn. In fact, like you should just force yourself to bet the turn 95% of the time. So we bet, and he folds. So, you know, kind of an uninteresting hand. Like this is one that you probably wouldn't even necessarily go over in your database, like with hand history review afterwards. But I think it's an important concept and one that comes up often enough that we should talk about. All right, I think that's a good stopping point for today. We covered a lot of good hand histories, gave you a lot of good tips, and hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hey, as always, really appreciate you guys leaving your comments in the forum. It's been awesome reading them.